Spring 1945. The Rhine River had been crossed. American forces pushed deep into Bavaria and the German Reich was collapsing. But in one small village near Fulda, the war was about to reveal something unexpected. A desperate child's scream would pierce through years of hatred. And what happened next would change everything. The villagers thought they knew about their enemies. This is the true story of Klaus Müller, the 8-year-old boy who begged an American soldier to save his mother, and the shocking act of compassion that followed. The morning of April 12, 1945, began with an eerie silence that felt more ominous than the artillery fire that had become the village's constant companion. Steinbach, a small Bavarian village of barely 300 souls, sat nestled in a valley near Fulda, surrounded by rolling hills that had once been covered in wildflowers. Now those hills were scarred with craters and trenches. The church steeple, which had stood for 4 centuries, leaned precariously to one side, its bells silent since the day a stray shell had struck it in February. 8-year-old Klaus Müller sat on the cold stone steps of what had once been his family's modest home. 3 walls still stood, but the roof was gone, taken by fire 2 months earlier when an incendiary bomb had landed in their neighbor's yard. Klaus had learned to recognize the different sounds of war: the whistle of incoming shells, the rumble of tanks, the sharp crack of rifle fire. But this morning, there was only silence, and somehow that was worse. His small hands trembled as he clutched a piece of stale bread, the last of their rations. He could not eat it. His stomach was too tight with worry. His mother, Margaret Müller, had left before dawn to retrieve supplies they had hidden in the old Schneider barn at the edge of the village. She was 9 months pregnant, her belly swollen, her movements slow and careful. Klaus had begged her not to go, but they needed those blankets, those medical supplies. The baby could come any day, perhaps any hour, and they had nothing prepared. Klaus remembered his mother's words as she kissed his forehead in the darkness. "Stay here, mein Liebling. Do not follow me. I will be back before the sun is high, I promise." But the sun was already climbing toward its peak, casting long shadows across the rubble-strewn streets, and she had not returned. Each minute that passed felt like an hour. Each hour felt like a lifetime. The village had changed in ways that went beyond the physical destruction. Klaus had watched as neighbors who once smiled and waved now turned their backs when his mother walked past. It had started 6 months ago when Margaret had been caught bringing food to the forced laborers who worked in the fields outside the village. Polish and Russian men and women, starving and beaten, treated worse than animals. Margaret could not stand it. She had smuggled bread, potatoes, whatever she could spare. When the authorities found out, they arrested her for 3 days. The local Nazi official, Hauptsturmführer Richter, had wanted to send her to a camp, but her husband's military record — he had died heroically on the Eastern Front in 1943 — had saved her. But it had not saved her from the villagers' judgment. They called her a traitor, a disgrace. Some spat when she walked past. Old Frau Kohler, who had once been her closest friend, crossed the street to avoid her. Herr Friedrich Weber, their neighbor for 10 years, told Klaus to his face that his mother was a shame to Germany. Klaus did not understand the hatred. His mother had taught him that people were people, that suffering was suffering, that kindness was never wrong. But he was just a child, and the adult world made no sense to him. Now, sitting on those cold steps, Klaus felt a fear deeper than any he had known. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. His mother would not break a promise unless something terrible had happened. Then he heard it, a sound that made his heart leap into his throat, a low, mechanical rumble growing louder with each second. Klaus stood, his legs shaking, and looked toward the main road that cut through the center of Steinbach. And there they were, American soldiers, a patrol of 6 men, moving in a tactical formation, their rifles at the ready, their helmets catching the morning light. They wore olive drab uniforms, so different from the field gray of the Wehrmacht. Their faces were hard, alert, scanning every window, every doorway, every pile of rubble that could hide an enemy. Klaus had been told stories about the Americans. The propaganda posters showed them as monsters, as brutal invaders who would burn villages and murder civilians. but desperation has a way of burning through propaganda. Klaus did not see monsters. He saw men, and he needed help. He ran. His small legs carried him down the steps, across the broken cobblestones faster than he had ever run in his life. His worn shoes slapped against the ground. He stumbled on a loose stone, fell hard, scraped his knee through his torn trousers. Blood seeped through the fabric, but he barely felt it. He scrambled back to his feet and kept running, his arms pumping, his breath coming in desperate gasps. The soldiers saw him coming. The lead man, a tall soldier with a weathered face, shouted something in English and raised his rifle. Another soldier, younger with red hair, moved to the side, taking a flanking position. A third dropped to one knee, his weapon aimed directly at Klaus. The message was clear even across the language barrier. Stop. Do not come closer. You could be a threat. But Klaus did not stop. He could not stop. His mother was dying. He knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. He screamed the only English word he had learned from listening to the BBC broadcasts his father used to secretly tune into before the war. Help, help, please, help. Sergeant Joseph Klein was the first to lower his rifle. At 32 years old, Klein had been fighting since North Africa. He had landed at Sicily, pushed through Italy, survived the Ardennes. He had seen more death than any man should see in 10 lifetimes. He had watched friends die in his arms, had killed men whose faces still haunted his dreams. War had hardened him, turned him into something cold and efficient. But it had not completely destroyed the man he had been before. The man who had been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania, who had read poetry, who had believed in the goodness of people. Something about this boy's desperation cut through all of Klein's defenses. He saw past the German uniform of childhood, past the enemy nationality. He saw only a terrified child. Klein stepped forward, his hand raised to signal the others to hold fire. He knelt down as Klaus reached him, the boy's momentum nearly knocking him over. Klaus grabbed Klein's uniform with both hands, his small fingers clutching the rough fabric, and pulled, pointing frantically toward the edge of the village where an old barn stood half-collapsed against the morning sky. "Mama," Klaus gasped, his chest heaving. "Mama ist da drin. Bitte, bitte helfen Sie. Please, please help." Klein did not speak German, but he understood. The universal language of desperation needed no translation. Someone was trapped. Someone needed help. He looked back at Captain Robert Hayes, the patrol commander. Hayes was 38, a career officer from Virginia, a man who lived by regulations and orders. Their mission was reconnaissance, gathering intelligence on German troop movements, not rescue operations. Every minute they delayed increased the risk of ambush, of casualties, of mission failure. But Hayes had also been a father once. His son had died of pneumonia in 1940 before the war, before everything changed. He saw that boy's face every time he looked at a child. He saw him now in Klaus's desperate eyes. Hayes nodded slowly. "Go, Klein. Take Miller and Rodriguez. But be careful. Could be a trap. Could be a sniper nest. 5 minutes. If it is not clear in 5 minutes, you pull back. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Klein replied. He turned to Klaus and gestured. "Show me. Take me there." Klaus ran ahead and Klein followed, his rifle ready, his senses alert. Privates Miller and Rodriguez covered them from behind, their weapons sweeping left and right. The village seemed deserted, but Klein knew that meant nothing. Windows could hide snipers, cellars could hide soldiers, every shadow could conceal death. They reached the barn in less than 2 minutes. It was an old structure, built sometime in the previous century, with thick stone walls and heavy wooden beams. But it had been hit. The roof had caved in on the eastern side, massive beams lying at twisted angles. Stone and debris covered the floor. Klaus stopped at the entrance, his whole body shaking, and pointed inside. Mama ist da drin." Klein entered carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and dust that hung in the air like fog. The smell hit him immediately. Smoke, dust, and something else. Blood. He moved deeper into the barn, stepping over broken equipment and shattered pottery. And then he heard it. A weak voice, barely more than a whisper, calling out in German, "Hilfe! Bitte! Mein Baby!" Klein moved toward the sound, his heart pounding. He pushed aside a section of collapsed roof, the wood heavy and splintered. And there she was, Margaret Müller, pinned beneath a massive oak beam that had fallen across her legs. Her face was pale, covered in dust and sweat. Her dress was torn and stained with blood. But what shocked Klein, what made his breath catch in his throat, was what she held in her arms. A baby. A newborn, still connected by its umbilical cord, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white but was now blackened by ash and soot. The infant was silent, terrifyingly silent, its tiny face gray. Margaret looked up at Klein with eyes that held both desperation and something else. Acceptance. She thought she was going to die. She thought her baby was already dead. Klein did not think. He acted. "Miller, Rodriguez, get in here. We need to lift this beam. Now." The two soldiers rushed in, assessed the situation, and positioned themselves. "On three," Klein ordered. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together, their muscles straining, their faces contorted with effort. The beam was incredibly heavy, easily 300 pounds. It rose inch by agonizing inch. Margarete cried out in pain as the pressure shifted, but she clutched the baby tighter. Finally, the beam was high enough. Klein grabbed Margarete under her arms and pulled her free, dragging her away from the debris. Miller and Rodriguez lowered the beam back down with a thunderous crash that sent up a cloud of dust. Klein knelt beside Margaret and gently took the infant from her arms. The baby was not breathing. Its lips were blue. Without hesitation, Klein cleared the infant's mouth with his finger, feeling for obstructions. Then he did something he had learned in basic training but never thought he would use. He placed his mouth over the baby's tiny nose and mouth and gave the gentlest breath he could manage. Once, twice, 3 times. The baby convulsed. Its chest moved, and then it cried. A weak, thin sound, but the most beautiful sound Klein had ever heard. The infant's face slowly turned from gray to pink. Its tiny fists clenched. It was alive. Klaus stood at the entrance, frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was watching an American soldier, a man he had been taught to fear and hate, cradle his newborn sister with a tenderness that defied everything he had been told about the enemy. Tears streamed down Klaus's dirty face, cutting clean lines through the dust. Klein looked at the boy and smiled, a rare expression on his war-weary face. "She is okay," he said, even though Klaus could not understand the words. "Your sister is okay." Captain Hayes arrived, having heard the commotion. He took in the scene immediately. The injured woman, the newborn baby, the desperate child. He knew what had to be done, even though it violated every tactical principle. "We stay until we get them medical help," he announced. "No one moves until a medic arrives." His men exchanged glances but nodded. They understood. Some things were more important than orders. Hayes radioed back to headquarters, requesting immediate medical support. The response was terse. "You are compromising your position. Complete your mission." But Hayes ignored it. He would face the consequences later. Word spread through Steinbach with the speed that only small villages can achieve. The Americans had stopped their patrol. They were staying in one place, vulnerable, exposed, and they were doing it to save Margaret Müller, the traitor, the woman who had helped the enemy. Villagers began to gather at a distance, watching from behind walls and around corners, afraid to get too close but unable to look away. Herr Friedrich Weber stood among them. He was 65 years old, his back bent from a lifetime of farm work, his face creased with deep lines. He had lived in Steinbach his entire life. He had known Margaret since she was a child, had watched her grow up, had danced at her wedding. But when she had helped those foreign workers, he had turned his back on her. He had called her a disgrace to his face. He had told others to shun her. He had felt righteous in his condemnation. Now, watching enemy soldiers risk their lives to save her, he felt something he had not felt in years. Shame, deep, burning shame that made his chest ache and his eyes sting with tears he refused to shed. An American medic arrived within the hour, riding in a jeep that tore through the village at dangerous speed. He was a young man, barely 20, with kind eyes and quick hands. He assessed Margaret's injuries with professional efficiency. Broken leg, possible internal bleeding, severe shock, but stable. He checked the baby, listening to her heart, examining her reflexes. Healthy. Incredibly, she is healthy. The medic arranged for a transport to take them to a field hospital 10 miles away. Klaus stayed close to his mother, holding her hand, refusing to let go. Margaret was barely conscious, but she looked at Klein one more time before they loaded her onto the stretcher. She spoke in broken English, words she had learned from her husband years ago. "Thank you. You save us. You save my baby." Klein's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. "It is okay," he finally managed. "You are safe now. You and your children are safe." As the transport drove away, Klaus looked back through the rear window. He saw Sergeant Klein standing in the middle of the ruined barn, covered in dust and blood that was not his own, watching them go. The image would stay with Klaus for the rest of his life. Captain Hayes gathered his men. "Let us move out. We have lost too much time." But before they could leave, Herr Friedrich Weber approached. He moved slowly, his steps hesitant, as if he were walking toward judgment. He stopped a few feet from Captain Hayes and spoke in German, his voice shaking. Private Rodriguez, who spoke some German, translated. "He says he is sorry. He says he was wrong about her. He says you showed him what it means to be human. He says he has been a coward and a fool." Hayes looked at the old man for a long moment. "Tell him that we are all fools sometimes. Tell him that what matters is what we do when we realize it." Rodriguez translated. Weber nodded, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. He turned and walked back to the gathered villagers, and Klein saw something shift in their expressions. Shame, recognition, perhaps the first stirrings of redemption. The patrol moved out, continuing their mission. But something had changed in each of them. They had been reminded that beneath the uniforms, beneath the flags and ideologies, there were only people. People who bled, who suffered, who loved, who needed help. The story of Sergeant Joseph Klein and Klaus Müller spread through Steinbach like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew. By the next day, neighboring villages had heard. The villagers who had condemned Margaret, who had spat at her and called her a traitor, now spoke of her differently. Some visited her in the hospital, bringing small gifts, offering stammering apologies that felt inadequate but were sincere. Frau Kohler brought flowers and wept. Herr Weber brought a hand-carved wooden toy for baby Anna and could barely speak through his tears. Margaret forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because she understood that hatred had poisoned everyone, that the war had twisted good people into something ugly, and that healing required forgiveness. The war ended 3 weeks later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The village of Steinbach, like millions of others across Europe, began the long, painful process of rebuilding. But something else had been rebuilt that day in April. The understanding that compassion does not recognize borders, that humanity can survive even in the darkest times, that a single act of kindness can ripple outward, changing hearts and minds in ways that weapons never can. Klaus Müller grew up in a new Germany, one that struggled to understand what it had become, what it had done, what it had lost. He attended school, worked hard, and never forgot the American soldier who had saved his mother and sister. He kept a photograph of Sergeant Klein that had been taken by a military photographer who had arrived with the medic. It showed Klein holding baby Anna, his face tired but gentle, his eyes revealing a soul that had seen too much but had not given up on goodness. Decades passed. Klaus became a teacher, like Klein had been before the war. He married, had children of his own, and told them the story of that April morning over and over. His daughter, Erika, became fascinated with the story and decided to help her father find the man who had saved her grandmother and aunt. It took months of research, letters to American military archives, and countless dead ends. But in 1982, they found him. Joseph Klein, living in a small town in Pennsylvania, retired, widowed, living alone in a modest house surrounded by books. When Klaus called him, Klein was silent for a long moment. Then he said simply, "I never forgot that day. I never forgot that little boy and his mother." Klaus traveled to America with his sister, Anna, now a grown woman of 37 with children of her own. They met Klein at his home on a warm summer afternoon. When Klein opened the door and saw them standing there, he knew immediately who they were. No introductions were needed. The three of them embraced, and Klein wept for the first time since his wife had died 5 years earlier. They spent 3 days together. Klaus and Anna told Klein about their lives, about how Margaret had lived until 1978, how she had spoken of him often, how she had named Anna's middle name, Joseph, in his honor. Klein told them about his life after the war, how he had returned to teaching, how that day in Steinbach had changed him, how he had spent his life trying to live up to the man he had been in that moment. Before they left, Klein gave Klaus something, a journal he had kept during the war. In it, he had written about that day in detail. "I want you to have this," Klein said. "I want the world to know what happened. Not to glorify me, but to show that even in war, even when everything seems lost, people can choose compassion. They can choose to see the humanity in their enemy." Klaus returned to Germany and worked with local historians to document the story. The village of Steinbach erected a small memorial in the square in 1985. It was a simple stone marker, not grand or imposing, but meaningful. The inscription read in both German and English. In the spring of 1945, compassion crossed the battle lines. An American soldier saved a German mother and child. May we never forget that our common humanity is stronger than any hatred. Joseph Klein died in 1989 at the age of 76. Klaus and Anna attended his funeral in Pennsylvania. The church was full of former students, fellow veterans, and community members whose lives Klein had touched. At the service, Klaus spoke about the man who had saved his family, about the choice he had made in a ruined barn in a devastated village, about the ripples that single act of kindness had created. "When we are young," Klaus said, his English now fluent after years of practice, "we believe the world is shaped by great leaders, by armies, by nations. But as we grow older, we learn the truth. The world is shaped by individual choices, by moments when one person decides to help instead of harm, to save instead of destroy, to see a human being instead of an enemy. My mother is alive because Sergeant Klein made that choice. My sister is alive because he made that choice. I am standing here today because he made that choice. That is the power we all have. That is the responsibility we all carry. The memorial in Steinbach still stands today. Students visit it on school trips. Tourists photograph it. But more importantly, the people of Steinbach remember. They remember what hatred did to their village, to their country, to the world. And they remember what compassion did, how it healed wounds that weapons had created, how it built bridges across chasms of enmity, how it proved that our shared humanity is the strongest force in the world. Anna Müller, now in her 80s, still lives in Steinbach. She has dedicated her life to peace education, traveling to schools across Germany and Europe, telling the story of her birth, of the American soldier who saved her life before she had taken her first breath. She carries with her the cloth that she was wrapped in, still stained with ash, preserved as a reminder. "This is what hate creates," she tells students, holding up the blackened cloth. "Destruction, death, despair. But this is also what love creates." She shows them a photograph of Klein holding her as an infant. Life, hope, redemption. History often remembers the battles, the strategies, the victories and defeats. It remembers the names of generals and politicians, the dates of invasions and surrenders. But sometimes the most important moments are the quiet ones. A child's desperate plea cutting through the machinery of war. A soldier's choice to help instead of harm, to save instead of kill. A community's realization that hatred is a choice and so is kindness. An old man's tears of shame that become tears of transformation. This is the story of Klaus Müller and Sergeant Joseph Klein. It is a story that reminds us that even in the worst of times, even when darkness seems overwhelming, humanity endures. It endures in the courage of a terrified child, in the compassion of a war-weary soldier, in the forgiveness of a persecuted woman, in the transformation of a hateful community. It endures because people choose to let it endure. The war ended 78 years ago, but the lessons remain. We still face hatred. We still face division. We still face the temptation to see others as enemies rather than as human beings. But we also still have the power to choose differently, to run toward those who need help instead of away from them, to extend a hand instead of raising a weapon, to save a life instead of taking one. Klaus Müller is 93 years old now. He still lives in Steinbach, in a small house near the memorial. He still tells the story to anyone who will listen, and he always ends it the same way. Sergeant Klein saved my mother and sister that day, but he saved something else too. He saved my faith in humanity. He showed me that goodness exists even in the darkest places, that compassion is stronger than hate, that one person can make a difference. That is what I want people to remember. Not just the story, but the lesson. That we all have that power. Every single one of us. The memorial stone in Steinbach catches the light differently depending on the time of day. In the morning, it glows soft and golden. In the evening, it casts a long shadow across the square. But at all times, it stands as a testament, not to war, but to what transcends war. Not to division, but to what unites us. Not to hatred, but to the love that overcomes it. This is the true story of the German child who begged a U.S. soldier to save his mother, and what happened next that shocked the entire village. It is a story of war, but more importantly, it is a story of peace. It is a story of death, but more importantly, it is a story of life. It is a story of hatred, but most importantly, it is a story of love. And it is a story that must never be forgotten. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in Sergeant Klein's position? How can we carry forward the lesson of compassion in our own lives? Let us know below.